With you all. So this is the Cambridge City website on climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning. This process was initiated about 10 years ago after some significant activism by myself and others to start preparing for climate change impacts. And what this study has revealed is that in Cambridge, we're particularly susceptible to heat and flooding. And as is often the case, our populations that are most vulnerable to both of these climate impacts are our poor and minority communities living in our densest neighborhoods where we have the fewest trees and the lowest lying land that is most susceptible to flooding. So we have climate justice challenges right here in wealthy Cambridge. So what this vulnerability assessment does is identify what the threats are and what the areas are where we need to respond. And then that informs our climate change preparedness and resilience planning, which is to begin preparing for these challenges. And so what we're doing there is a lot of infrastructure work around sewer separation and stormwater infrastructure projects to prepare for large flooding events, as well as tree canopy work to restore our tree canopy and to do so in an equitable way so that we're particularly attentive to the areas where we have the least canopy right now. So that's a very quick high-level overview of our efforts here in Cambridge and how we are tying that into racial justice and equity.
Thank you very much, Quinton, for such a robust information, and I'd like to see that. And now I'm going to hand it over to Crew, the representative Ethan Mcdonough, and he will give us some information on Crew.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so my name is Ethan Mcdonough. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a fellow at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, which is part of a department from an organization called Better Future Project, which really tries to build and support grassroots movements. So some of our other departments, we have 350 Mass, which I see is present here today from New Hampshire. We have Divested, and then Communities Responding to Extreme Weather is our newest and younger department. And what we specifically do is focusing on building like equitable, inclusive neighborhood climate resilience through hands-on services such as education, planning, and strategizing. So what that encapsulates, I guess, would be that while state organizations, local government, federal government, they all do a lot of work trying to prepare ourselves for climate, Crew takes the approach that communities also need to take steps to make sure that they're protected and that their most vulnerable populations are safe. So what we try to push for is concepts such as Crew teams, which are concerned community members who come together in order to push for climate initiatives such as tree planting, such as pushing their communities to create better floodways, but also more social resiliency side of things, which would be like doing neighborhood check-ins to make sure that the elderly people in your community are being looked out for during a heat wave, or, you know, donating extra clothes, jackets, underwear, socks during the winter if you don't need it for people who might need them during cold snaps. So there's a lot of social kind of resilience work that we do, trying to connect different individuals together. Another facet that we do, as well as creating resilience hubs, which is like a new program of ours where different physical locations and entities in a community will allow their buildings and spaces to be used during emergencies. So mostly we've been focusing on like what are the staples in communities and like how can we leverage pre-existing organizations that already hold a lot of weight, such as like libraries, churches. We're looking into more of the commercial side of things as well, trying to like push for restaurants and cafes and areas that have larger public spaces to be willing to open up. And then again, there's this whole new layer of COVID-19, which has kind of changed how we look at stuff. So we're really focused on finding ways to still provide services and reframe our thinking around solutions now that we have live in like a social distance era. So we're doing a lot of stuff right now on like trying to find ways to make people that can help people access cool locations while also staying at a safe distance from one another. So that's just like a brief overview of some of the stuff that we do and what we've been working on. And I can pass it on to whoever is next.
Perfect. Thank you, crew, and thanks, Ethan. Now we're going to hand it over to the FEMA representative, Sara Varela. Sara, welcome, and we're so happy to have FEMA here to talk more about disaster preparedness, and you have the floor, Sara.
Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is share my screen and talk a little bit about the 10 individual preparedness actions that we encourage people to do at FEMA. We organize our preparedness focused to individuals and focused on businesses. And today I'm going to share my presentation and talk about our focus on individuals. And just a second, let me pull up the photo here. So these are the 10 different preparedness actions that as an individual, we encourage you to take. I'm going to go through my 4 favorite ones first, and then I'll hit on the other 6. But one of the easiest ones that you can do is to sign up for alerts and warnings around how your local emergency manager communicates with you as a community. So in most of New England communities, there's a system called Code Red, but what I would encourage everybody to do is to look at the website of your town website. And normally the town websites have like different departments. So if you find either an emergency management tab or fire chief or police chief, normally around those 3 areas, you can find the information and you can identify how your local community, your town or your city sends emergency alerts to all of you and your neighbors. So that's the first thing that you could do to be better prepared, right? Is to make sure that you receive local alerts and warnings from your local emergency manager. But there are also other very well-known apps that you can use on your smartphone, like the FEMA app. You can download that, or the Red Cross app, or the Weather Channel app. Basically, any app that gives you information about weather alerts and warnings is one way you can be better prepared. The other way you can be better prepared is to discuss your family emergency communication plans with your family. And so I'm going to share with you on the, let's see, emergency communications plan. On the chat, I'm going to put this link so that you guys can click on the link and look at all of the great resources that FEMA has for emergency communications plans. It's basically just a format, and you can, let me see, how do I go back to this chat? You can, I'm gonna put it right here in the chat. You can download any sort of form, but since I put it right here in the chat, I'm also just gonna go ahead and share it with you. I had it, so that's the link that I sent on the chat. You are all more than welcome to click on it. There is the emergency alerts and warnings that I was talking about. There is, this is why my family's household communication plan. That's a great link. It's a downloadable PDF. And so those are one of my favorites. The other one is the Emergency Preparedness Kit. So do you have in your household enough food and water for each of the individuals living in your household for at least 72 hours? That's a third action that you can take that is very easy if you plan it with time, so that if there is an emergency, and for some reason you can't leave the house, that you have enough food and water for the first 72 hours. So again, if you click on this link, you would be getting to that, the checklist that we have. But I'm also going to share with you the direct link here. Here is another link to a different FEMA website that I really like, and I like to share the links with you so that you can check them out as I speak as well. So that's the other one that takes you to the emergency supply kit, and it gives you a sense of the types of different things that you need in addition to food and water to have an adequate emergency supply kit. And then this last link here is a link to the overall FEMA website that, did I stop sharing my screen? I think I stopped sharing my screen, right? Or are you guys looking?
Yes, you have.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again. So there we go. So the overall FEMA website, ready.gov, is really the FEMA website that was created for the community. It has a special link here for pandemic, but then it also has the types of different preparedness actions that I had just identified, like building a kit. You can download that, do the checklist, and make sure that you have everything ready. It talks about the emergency alerts, and it talks about creating a family emergency communications plan. So those 3 or 4 different individual preparedness actions are very easy, simple to take, and they make a big difference when there is an emergency. So we covered accessing alert and warnings, creating a communications plan, assembling a supply kit. There are also other types of things like participating in this discussion and learning more about it, taking a class or a drill, and I will be sharing an additional link around businesses for that. But then there are things like the work that crew is doing, preparing with your neighbors, talking with your neighbors and identifying who in your neighborhood has what, so that if there is an emergency and all of a sudden your neighborhood is isolated, you already know which are the assets that exist within your neighborhood. So creating a neighborhood plan, conducting an exercise, just like we are used to conducting fire drills and earthquake drills, exercising an escape route from your house. Those types of things are also very helpful. Another action that we like to encourage people to do is to make your property safe. So, you know, if there's a big windstorm or something, just go out of your house, take a look around, make sure that anything that could possibly fly away is tied up or put away, and be conscious of the different things that you can do to make your property safe. Also take a look at your insurance. A lot of homeowners insurance doesn't cover flood, and so it's an important thing to consider, especially if you live in a high flood zone, to purchase additional flood insurance. The other thing that you can do as a really easy way to be better prepared is to identify which are the important documents that you might need, and your home in an emergency, that you have backups of those documents either saved up on the cloud or on a USB drive, or you have a folder that you can easily grab that is waterproof and you can take with you, so that you have all of your important documents like identification documents, insurance documents, those types of things. So those are the 10 different basic individual preparedness actions that we encourage you to take. And they are very easy. Most of them are free. You just need to put some time to make them happen. And it's mostly an effort to communicate with your family and plan ahead and think about the different things that could happen in your area. And that's it for me.
Excellent, Sarah. Really, really important. I'm going to open the floor to any comments from the audience that would like to ask Sarah any questions from the presentation. The floor is for the audience who is here listening. Any questions, any comment?
Andrew, and I just put in the chat the last link that brings people to the course, one of the courses that we offer for businesses, which is called OPEN, which stands for Organizations Prepared for Emergency Needs. And there's a 30-minute interactive online version of the course that anybody can take, and it's all for free as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Any comments, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Sarah. What might a community emergency preparedness drill look like? I really think that's an amazing idea to actually do the physical drill and get people kind of understanding how they move around their area and where meeting spots would be. But I guess how do we plan for different kinds of climate? And then how do we incorporate that into drills?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can do things like evacuation drills, and a lot of times local emergency managers, depending on where you live, will schedule some sort of an evacuation drill. But even if your local emergency manager isn't conducting those types of exercises, it's good for you to become familiar with alternate routes to leave your house, to identify where there might be bottlenecks, and really also just to get to know your local emergency manager. So I think one additional preparedness action that I'd like to strongly encourage everybody to do today, if they can, is to look at their town's website and identify who is their local emergency manager, and just stop by whenever you can and say hello. Most of the time, the local emergency manager is your fire chief or your police chief, and they have a lot on their plates. So it's nice for you to get to know them while there is no emergency, so that if there is an emergency at one point, you've already established that relationship with that person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. I see Miranda just joined us. Any other comments or questions for Sarah with regards to FEMA disaster preparedness? She had highlighted ready.gov, which is very informative. It talks about FEMA response to coronavirus. Resources are there: pandemic, building a kit, extreme heat, hurricanes, flooding, and emergency alert, and making a plan. So I just wanted to ask you, Sarah, when you're making a plan, how advanced someone should make that plan, and who is involved in the plan? Is it everyone in the household? Can you elaborate more on the making a plan?
Sure, yes. So ideally it would be everybody in your household, including kids. And we do have on the FEMA.gov page a site for kids and special templates for kids to build their own communication plan along with their parents. Basically, you want to make sure that you talk about meeting points, like where are you going to meet if something happens and you can't connect via phone. For example, during the Boston Marathon, the phone lines were so busy because everybody was trying to reach everybody that people weren't able to reach their family or loved ones. So think about the possibility that that could happen, that there could be a situation where your phone, your mobile phones don't work, and then identify either a physical location where you would go to meet your family, or identify a phone number outside of your local geographical area. Let's say your aunt that lives in Houston or your parents that live in Florida, because again, during the Boston Marathon, what was identified was that phone calls within the Metro Boston area were really not going through. But if you called outside the Metro Boston area, you could make a call, right? So maybe identify somebody outside of your local geographical area that all the family members would call in case you can't communicate among each other. So that's one thing to think about that is really easy. Also, think about using text, especially when you're dealing with senior citizens. Senior citizens are not very familiar with the text function on the phone. And again, when cell phone coverage is not ideal, many times sending a text is a more reliable way to communicate. So talk about that and let not only the senior people in your household, but the kids in your household know that that's an option. Talk about if there are any people in your household that need important medication, where are they keeping reserves of that medication and how can they access it? Talk about, yeah, like we said before, the way that you would exit or enter back into your house. But mostly the family emergency communication plan should be a plan that is done with your nucleus family, with the household of people that you live with, and maybe share it with a couple of relatives that are not in your households, so that they are all able to communicate. One of the things that we did in the past with some of my friends was we all shared our emergency contact phone number with our neighbors. So let's say my next door neighbor has something going on. I know I have her son's phone number and I can call her son. And she knows she has my sister's phone number. So we all shared at least one emergency phone number outside of our household so that our neighbors could contact somebody else if we needed that. So those types of things, just kind of thinking about it as a family.
Okay, great. Anyone else have any other question to ask Sarah?
I'm sorry, I jumped in late, just got on. I'm not sure the scope of, in terms of disaster preparedness. Is it just local, your own family preparedness, or are you talking about organizationally too?
So Miranda, if the last link that I put, community.fema.gov/open training, that is the training that we have offering for organizations. And it also kind of walks through 10 different action steps that organizations can take to be better prepared.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, you in part of the make a plan, one of the things, can you talk about the evacuation? You know, for instance, we see here it's when we prepare for a hurricane, know where to go if asked to evacuate quickly. Can you expand more on that, on the evacuation?
Yeah, sure. That's when I was saying that it's always helpful to identify if your town has evacuation routes. For example, in my town, there are certain streets that are marked evacuation routes. So identify if your town has an evacuation route. Reach out to your local emergency manager to see what the evacuation plan is for your town, and make sure that everybody in your household that knows how to drive is familiar with the main routes and alternative routes to come in and out of your neighborhood.
Excellent, great.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, Sarah, for the preparedness for neighbors and neighborhoods, I know you spoke about preparing with neighbors, and we're assuming that it's a cohesive neighborhood. But what if it's not? How does that look? How do we prepare with a neighbor that is a neighborhood that is not a cohesive neighborhood? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we kind of fall back into the basics of community building at that point, right? And really encouraging people to reach out to their neighbors, to get to know their neighbors, to build those relationships during what we call blue sky days. So to reach out to neighbors, get to know your neighbors. There is a great organization that has these neighborhood projects where they have what is very similar to an incident command structure, but they frame it in a way so that a neighborhood could build a potluck or a barbecue or any sort of street gathering, right? And so basically it's a way to encourage neighborhoods or neighbors and communities to create some sort of a common project, to create a sense of belonging, to build those relationships, to establish communication channels, to exchange contact information, to kind of do all the pre-work that needs to happen so that you can then at some point talk about emergency preparedness as well. But if you don't have those existing relationships built yet, then you probably want to start with just getting together as a small group and identifying a project that everybody can rally around, that they feel ownership around, and that they can that serves as a platform to build those relationships. And I'm not really sure what other type of activities CREW does, but I love the name. What is it? Community resilient?
It's communities responding to extreme weather.
To extreme weather. So do you guys do a lot of community building types of activities that are grassroots led?
That is like what we want to get more into. At first, we were really trying to push for this concept of CREW teams, which would be like a small group of individuals from a community or neighborhood that already does have that connection. Like it could be, you know, a group of friends or relatives who are interested in building resilience. And then from there, they go to expand. But I think definitely, I think it was Ruth who brought up that question, but it was just a really good question because it makes you realize, you know, how much more of that original cohesiveness you need as a base layer for all of this, because everything else is objective. Like, you know, trying to understand the assets or the vulnerable groups in your community, all of that becomes very objective if you don't have that cohesive relationship there. But I would say, like, along that point too, it doesn't hurt to try to be objective if your neighborhood's still not fully there yet and you're still doing like community events, but like still getting together with a group of neighbors, friends, or even like CREW would have people that would be willing to allocate to this. I mean, it's hard right now with COVID, but in general, we would have people where we could go out and do a vulnerability assessment, which is pretty much just a group of people doing a questionnaire in like a predetermined area. So like whatever you would define as your neighborhood, or if you just want to even do it for your block specifically, but that's like a series of questions that helps people understand that you're trying to come up with a community-based idea for responding to a flood or a heat wave, cold snap. So I think like there's two different approaches, and like first and foremost, like we should be trying to build cohesion through like events, through community gatherings. But as that becomes more difficult with COVID right now, I think it also can be helpful if that seems to be like a blockage to go out there and be objective and like get together with a group of people and be like, you know, our neighborhood's not fully there yet, but it's still important to ask these questions and still important to discover the people in our communities that are willing to work with us on coming up with a plan of action, so to say, like, you know, for the next heat wave, for a flood. So I think like, yeah, you want to build that base layer, but also like this stuff can happen very quickly, and like you have to be prepared. So even if not all that groundwork is done yet, it's still important to like go out there and try to build those relationships regardless.
Yeah, I want to weigh in here as well. We are in the middle of an emergency right now. It's COVID-19. And we saw in Cambridge, a mutual aid network arose quite spontaneously and very quickly in response to that emergency. And, you know, even myself, I called all my neighbors and checked in with them, make sure everybody's okay. And that's all based on relationships that we've built up over the years. So it's really important during the sort of non-emergency times, as Sarah was saying, to build those relationships and just, you know, very basic, you know, just say hi to your neighbors, make sure you have each other's contact info so that when there is a problem, you can reach out and connect with each other and support each other.
Yeah, one other link that I just posted on the chat is to the Citizen Emergency Response Team page. So we use the acronym of CERT to talk about these groups, but basically CERT is a program that trains any volunteer. You go through a 20-hour training and acquire some basic emergency preparedness skills. And some neighborhoods have what we call neighborhood emergency response teams. So it's basically a group of volunteers that have taken on this training and that sign up and are ready to be the first responders in case of an emergency. And we know by fact that really the first responders always tend to be family and neighbors, and it's afterwards that the actual, you know, EMT or firefighter or policemen show up. But the real first responders always tend to be your own family or your own neighbors. So another way to kind of create that sense of community could be to enroll in an emergency in a Citizen Emergency Response Team class and get together with your neighbors and encourage them to do the same thing.
Great.
I'm just want to make a few comments too from Philadelphia, my city. Basically, we are not in a hurricane zone. I know there are other disasters like you talked about, mutual aid during the COVID-19. I'm a part of a mutual aid group, a coalition of several organizations dealing with this pandemic, but also we do have a system where the city can reach us. We also have an Amber Alert that goes out. So your phones, you might be in the subway and everyone's phone is jiggling and making noise, vibrating and everything. There is that way that the city could reach us. And in the township that I'm in, they're able to reach us out too. So those things have been done. But I am more so concerned about Caribbean people. I know we're living here in the United States, but also too, my concern is hurricanes back home in our Caribbean countries. They're not so much prepared like our cities, our big cities, or you know. So I'm concerned about those hurricane preparedness and resiliency plans. So that's where my concerns are.
Megan has a question. Megan, you could go ahead. Thank you, Miranda. Megan, unmute.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, panelists, and thank you for sharing. Good evening to my fellow participants. My question has to do with the fact that COVID-19 is both a health crisis as well as an environmental crisis. The BAME community has been seriously impacted in the US, in particular, as it relates to COVID-19, and much of the underlying issues besides those related to poverty also has to do with the environment. And maybe I shouldn't even say besides, because they're interlinked. So at this stage, I'd like to find out, are there any scoping studies that are looking at the magnitude to which, trying to identify the extent to which the problems were environmental, looking at the key focus areas and indicators that should be tracked around climate justice for the community, and priority for mitigation action, especially as it relates to building space, maybe even places of work. I'm glad buildings, Sara, business, I'm glad Sara included business and their role in that, in this discussion. Thanks, and to anyone who would respond.
Yeah, I can respond to that a little bit. Certainly in Cambridge, we are very focused on reducing emissions, particularly in the building sector. And I was partially responsible for that plan, which we call the Net Zero Action Plan, which was adopted in 2015, and we're executing to that plan to get all of our building emissions ultimately down to zero. And in terms of the environmental causes, at least in Cambridge, I think there's a pretty good understanding that these are all ultimately environmental side effects that we're experiencing, including COVID. Our vulnerability assessment did look at disease vectors as well, mosquito-borne illnesses coming north into Massachusetts and things like that. So there's pretty good awareness of that. Of course, it's pretty challenging to have a significant impact on global environmental issues from a small city like Cambridge, but at least we can try to lead on some of these issues and set examples that others can follow. So, for example, we banned plastic grocery bags a few years ago, and we're now looking at a complete ban on plastics. And then in terms of environmental justice, again, we always try to look at these issues in terms of equity and impacts on minority communities and others who have been disadvantaged. And so when we look at our tree canopy as an example, we're looking very specifically at what neighborhoods historically have a lack of tree canopy, and how does that impact people in terms of flood risk, heat risk, and then how do we mitigate that? Because one of the reasons, for example, that our wealthier neighborhoods have more trees is that there's more private property to plant the trees on. The poorer neighborhoods tend to be more dense, and they don't have a lot of yard space to plant trees. So how do we as a city compensate for that through parks and open space, street tree plantings, and how do we focus attention on those specific areas so that we are doing some environmental justice at the same time as preparing for climate change overall.
Thank you so much, Councillor Quintion. I'm glad to know the initiatives that's happening there.
Megan, and I also just put the last link that I put there, FEMA.gov/Region 2 National Preparedness has a bunch of webinar recordings specifically focused on the Caribbean. And so I don't know if you might find any of those interesting or helpful, but they did a series of about 5 different preparedness webinars that were specifically focused looking at the Caribbean.
Thank
Great,
you so
Sarah.
much, sir.
Thanks, Megan, because Miranda had also mentioned that how the region, I know some Caribbean are up there because Megan, you had played a role in Jamaica disaster preparedness, but you have other smaller islands. Go ahead, Megan.
Well, mind you, I was here as a participant, but I have a background. I was former corporate strategy planner at the National Environment and Planning Agency in Jamaica for a couple of years. We still consult in the area of environment, climate finance, and so on and so forth. So I'm well aware that a number of Caribbean countries, including Jamaica, are putting their various climate finance strategy plan and minus climate finance environmental things and so on and so forth. To the end of last year, we worked on climate finance strategy planning and so on. So yes, there's work being done and so on, but in line with Andrew's top theme for this evening, I'd imagine it's actually getting the grassroots people mobilized for the most part, being ready to be ready before, and what actions they can take, what to do during and after. And there's always need for capacity building there because there has to be ongoing. And then there's the social marketing, the need for social marketing solutions, not social media now, but social marketing. So you will have awareness creation, but you will have actions. In fact, in North America here, I've noticed in many Black and Caribbean communities, you tend to find more garbage. And this is a fact. You tend to find more garbage. I'm not talking about like big pileup. I'm talking about cans, papers, and so on the streets and so on. I think this has to do with people rushing out to work and maybe not taking maybe, you know, even just coming together as communities and maybe deciding to pay somebody, maybe somebody who is homeless, a drug addict or something like that, to not for addiction money at all, but for food and maybe with some counseling. How can you do things like that? So you have street cleaning, because this boils down to mental health and ambitions and so on, and feeling included, things like those. What kinds of strategies do we have in place?
Yes, go ahead, Ethan.
I was just going to say, yeah, with the grassroots action, that's exactly where crew kind of falls into this. Same with like the intersection of, you know, climate activism and social justice, is that unfortunately with states, with locals, local groups, everything, there's just a series of process that need to go through in order for stuff to take place and for real action to take place. So our whole trajectory there is like, let's get local communities to get together and address that problem of, you know, cleaning up that trash and like making sure that that community member is like sought out and like, do you need any help, etc. And that is like where our crew team thing really comes into play, and like what we've been pushing for super hard. And whether that is using a pre-existing group like a neighborhood association, or whether it is just a group of like 4 or 5 individuals. But that's where we think a lot of this change could happen. And with those teams of concerned individuals, you know, we could, crew is like an organization that doesn't try to push any initiatives, doesn't try to tell community members like, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z to make your community more resilient. But we offer like materials that can help communities get to that point, or help communities, like if you want to do vulnerability mapping, like we have a whole toolkit that we can just like send the PDF over to someone and they can print it out and do the work. And then we also have people available to help with the work in general as well. But like the big part of it is like grassroots, because every single community is different and every single climate scenario is different as well. Like the most, like what's going to happen, you know, when it comes to somewhere like Jamaica, like Miranda was saying, like, you know, what can communities do there is extremely different than what it's going to be like in Cambridge or even within the greater Boston area. Like Cambridge compared to, you know, Dorchester is going to have a whole different strew of problems that are going to impact them first and like what's more likely to happen. So like not having umbrella plans that are like, okay, this is what our whole city and our whole region needs to do to be prepared, but rather like, what do you see happening every day in your community? What intersections do you notice get flooded every time there's a rainstorm? And like allowing community members to make their own climate plans. But yeah, that stuff takes time. And then I think it also just takes, you know, people who are willing and have the capacity to do that extra work, which I think is the more difficult side of all this, right? Like, you know, that person who doesn't throw away their trash, you know, how can we ensure that there is someone who has enough time to volunteer themselves to become part of a team? And that's where things get more tricky.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. There are some systems in place, at least I know for Philadelphia, and where we have block captains and all these things, their wards and all these, you know, there are different systems of operation, neighborhood revitalization and all these things that already exist. So I'm not sure if it's the same for every city, but at least in Philadelphia, we do have those strong networks of organizations and entities that are already existing that really gets the word out and that takes care of the trash and neighborhood block captains who oversee a lot of stuff and have parties and those things. So some of those networks are with you know, available within us at in terms of a big city. I'm not sure about the other cities and how many cities do we have represented here besides Boston, Philadelphia. So I'm not sure all the details, but to your response, some of these systems are in place. And yeah, I just wanted to contribute that.
And we see that back to the community importance about the neighborhood association and the community organization. Sarah, one of the things that as a resident in those associations, there should be some kind of disaster preparedness committee in there that is looking at how the community will respond to it. And Ethan, that's where crew comes in, where plans are in place to work, and you are currently working with some of the communities.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a sec. Could you say that one more time?
I was saying that as a community, as a resident of whichever community you have, in that community, there should be some sort of, as what Sarah was speaking about, disaster preparedness planning in place for that. And that's where you guys come in crew in terms of providing that support for the communities itself. And I know, Quinton, you, at the beginning of your presentation, you were speaking more about that also for Cambridge.
Yeah, the neighborhood groups are really important. We also have, in particular in Central Square, a business improvement district, and you know, those are sometimes problematic, but in this case, we're working very closely with them to hire people from the neighborhood to do some of the cleanup, to act as ambassadors and you know, help people out. So that's another mechanism that we're using here, but it's really important to have functioning, active neighborhood associations you know, even informal networks of neighbors who know each other, who are connected, who can respond quickly in case of an emergency.
Yeah, I also wanted to share one of the other links that I posted on the chat is this website called Nextdoor.com, and some municipalities have been using Nextdoor.com as a way to hear from the community and do all sorts of things. So some municipalities do it as kind of that citizen reporting type of thing, where if there's a pothole, you can take a picture of the pothole, send it to, post it on Nextdoor.com, and if your community is linked to it, then it goes directly into the queue for things to be improved in the community. But also things like, hey, there's a tree that fell on the street, or there's a water leakage on the street. So that's also a very nice resource. And given the social distancing constraints that we're facing currently, it might be a nice way to get to know your neighbors. You put in your address and your zip code, and it automatically then connects you with people that live around you. But even things like Facebook sometimes have local geographical groups. So if you type the name of the city where you live on the search engine on Facebook, you might be able to find lots of different neighborhood groups that you could start associating with and just start to get to know people. Because I do know that during these social distancing times, it's really hard to identify ways to build those relationships.
I think Nextdoor is a great app. The only thing you do have to be careful of is like sometimes maybe avoiding, there can be like scams on there every now and then. But other than that, it's an amazing app. And going off of all this stuff, what I'm thinking about is like, because this is a question that we get asked a lot at Crew, especially from communities where they're like, well, these pre-existing systems, you know, we already have them. So in no way is about like throwing out something and then trying to implement a new system. It's all like, we're all for and all about like leveraging pre-existing things. If your neighborhood already has a Facebook group, like promote, you know, having a team that's all about climate, or leveraging a team that already exists there. Or if you have like the neighborhood or block captains, stuff like that, like how can we coordinate with them more? And then also like just a constant flow of connection between community members and those kind of services is like what's most important. Like it's really beneficial to have teams that focus on climate and cleanups and et cetera in your community, but communities are like always growing, always evolving and adapting, and like that needs to, there also needs to be like a strong line of communication between different climate teams, organizations, et cetera, or even neighborhood associations with their present and ever growing community. Because like a lot of disconnects can happen, and within a couple of generations, you can have a lot of community members who aren't even aware that there is a neighborhood association or that there is a pre-existing climate team. Like I found that in my own community. There's been a neighborhood association in my neighborhood ever since I was a child, and I never really heard much from them or heard anything about them. So it's all about like definitely keeping the stuff that's there and working, but just making sure that everyone has access to it. And like if that's already the case, then that's great. But you know, making sure that no one is left out of those situations, those solutions, and the information that comes from them.
Great. So we see that we're now here discussing disaster preparedness, and coming out of the discussion is the importance of planning ahead for a disaster, whether it's extreme heat, pandemic, hurricane, extreme weather. Sarah just wanted to go over some of the key points in terms of planning ahead. I know you discussed about connecting with emergency alert and making a plan. I don't know if you want to just over briefly with us the importance of planning ahead. Clear your mic.
There we go. I can share this again with everybody. So these are some 10 basic preparedness actions that you can think about taking, and they do identify accessing alerts and warnings, creating a family emergency communications plan, building your emergency supply kit, doing a practice or drill around emergency preparedness, reaching out and connecting with your neighbors and identifying your local neighborhood assets and needs, participating in a class like this one, or a discussion or a conversation where you can get other tips and ideas, conducting some sort of an exercise or attending a class. Like we also have another class called Until Help Arrives, which is a conversation around what would you do if you're the first person on an emergency scene before the EMTs arrive. What types of things do you have to do? And it's a course that goes on for about 1 or 2 hours, and we used to do it in person, but now that we're doing so much on Zoom, we'd be happy to do a Zoom version of Until Help Arrives as well. And finishing with the 3 last actions: making property safer. So looking around and taking mitigating actions that can be done prior to an emergency, thinking ahead, identifying which are your important documents that you need to have backups of and that you can access easily, even if you're not at home, like putting them on the cloud, sending yourself attachments of PDF files so that you can access them in your emails, putting them on a USB drive, those types of things.
Excellent. That is so critical, those 10 pointers. Hopefully everyone was making some notes, and also that is available on the FEMA website. Am I correct, Sarah? You could just highlight where they could find it.
That is correct.
It's on the ready.gov.
Yes. Any of the links that have the ready.gov will take you to any of the different preparedness steps.
Great. And I know one of the things that I know Miranda spoke about, we as diaspora members, we can take advantage of some of the training that FEMA has provided, and that was one of the stuff that you just mentioned, which we can also provide assistance to our Caribbean folks in the region. And also we see that FEMA Region II, which is the one that is responsible for the Caribbean region, also will be able to provide, who has been providing support to Caribbean region, but we as an organization too can also provide support for our community in terms of ensuring that they have these plans in place. I know a lot, when you talk to a lot of people, even just having a fire extinguisher in their house, you know, when you ask, do you have a fire extinguisher in your house? A lot of people might not even think that it's important to have a fire extinguisher in the house, or the importance of the smoke detector or the carbon monoxide. So those are some critical stuff, and that comes right under the checklist, you know, making your plans, you know, going through that checklist, connecting, ensuring that you're connected to the emergency alert system, knowing who to reach out to in case of emergency. Also, you also mentioned, Sarah, about emergency contact, just in case something happens. I I will never forget, and I know everyone has this 9/11. That was something that I was in Costa Rica and I was trying to call New York and all the phone was jammed. So you're so right. I had to call another person, another family member in another area who were able to communicate with those who were in New York. So, you know, very vital, important thing. Any other, Megan, you have another question?
Oh, yes, thank you. And again, this is for all panelists. I'm just wanting to know, are there, from your experience, what are some of the best governance models that you've had for having both citizen and government engagement and participation for facilitating change as it relates to preparedness and resilience? And I must thank Sarah there too for mentioning the need for citizen-generated data as it relates to disaster and so on, and not just at the time of disaster, but before, so we can know. So my two questions had to do with governance models, and then are there any form of technical support or climate finance support, whether it be small grants and so on, plus the technical through Caribbean islands and maybe even US states that are within the Caribbean? And can diasporians apply in partnership with Caribbean-based entities and so on?
Megan, maybe I could start by saying what I've always heard FEMA say, and I want to make sure that I'm clear that I'm not representing FEMA, right? FEMA is my client, and I am here as a liaison to make sure all of you know all of the resources that are available for individuals and communities around preparedness. So FEMA has this saying that all emergencies are local and the response is local. And the way this works is that the emergencies happen at the local level and are resolved at the local level. If the local community feels they need additional help, the way it works is that then they will call on to their governor to request additional help. And if the governor feels like the state cannot support the resources needed to solve that emergency at the local level, then they will bring it up to the federal government and declare an emergency declaration. And it's not until an emergency declaration is issued by the governor and declared by the president that FEMA actually gets involved. So really FEMA's role is mostly to support local and state leadership, because we normally take a back role. And I guess the reason why I want to share this is because it's important to emphasize that mostly it's at the local level that you will find the solutions. So don't underestimate the power of a small group of people getting together and trying to identify the assets and liabilities of your community, trying to identify the social capital and the resources that you have, and coming up with the solutions to the problems as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And I know Crew can elaborate more on their community response. Can you give us a little bit more on it, Ethan, on the Crew, how far you guys are doing and the more outreach? I know that we're planning to work with Crew on the Caribbean community here, the diaspora community here, in terms of the training, to look at what is there and identify persons who can be that key contact in the community.
Yeah, I would say like teams are a really big part, and then so getting together, like Sarah just mentioned, having that group of 5 people to do a vulnerability assessment, and conversely do like an asset assessment. So like she used that great term, social capital, like understanding, you know, who your community leaders are, who has resources, who is willing and able to help people out. You know, are your libraries going to be open? Are there church groups that can help people, like mutual aid groups, etc.? So yeah, we would like work with crew teams. That's kind of like what our thing would be, provide any strategy materials, facilitation materials for these teams to accomplish, you know, their local goals. And then on top of that, when it comes to physical help, what we're looking into doing is starting resilience hubs, which, you know, like I mentioned earlier, are physical entities that would serve as shelters to different capacities. So our initial one would be a resilience hub, which would be a pretty limited sheltering capacity, but would provide a lot of events such as this one, would provide informational resources as well. Something that we were just about to send out right before COVID happened was these emergency preparedness kits, and we would send a lot of them out to different libraries and churches and any of our resilience hubs. Unfortunately, we were only able to make like enough where they would have one sample one, which would allow people to see all the items that they would need for emergency situation, 72 hours. But then they would have like an additional, unfortunately right now the number is super low, but an additional 4 or 5 that could be for people who, you know, are in really dire straits and can't access any of that. I also think something, and this is kind of off topic, that should be mentioned as well, is like, if people have the capacity, especially, and they have like the economic ability to make more than one emergency preparedness kit, it's really important because a lot of the times we will be on the road when this stuff happens, or we won't be at our household. And if your emergency preparedness kit or prep kit is in the basement of your house and you're driving back from work, your house could already be flooded and all that gear is no longer useful, or you might not even be able to access it. But yeah, as for organizational wide stuff, I think it would be like getting together, building that community cohesion in your neighborhoods, and like making sure that you do that work now before this kind of stuff happens. Having really solid plans with your immediate family, but also with your community. Doing a vulnerability mapping is probably like the #1 thing that a group of concerned people can do. And that's like figuring out who is going to be the most vulnerable. Like, who are the people that are elderly or have children that might be at the home by themselves, or etc.
Disability.
So that, yeah, disabilities. I mean, like it's a pretty large list there. And I think a lot of it too is also really community based. What your community needs and like what vulnerable means in your community. If we're just taking like a top down approach, like you really have to be in a specific community and know who your people are before you can start determining what steps need to be taken first. So that's kind of like, I know a lot of that is probably reiterating things I've already said, but as for grassroots organization, I would say that. And then with leadership wise, again, like we're all about leveraging pre-existing systems. Like if there's a community neighborhood association, we're not going to try to say, okay, you need to find new leadership and create a new structure. Like we want to use that structure, provide resources, provide any kind of help that we can, but also like push those groups to expand their breadth in the community. Like make sure that people know that your neighborhood association or that your climate group that already exists, like make sure your fellow community members are aware that you're there. And look into recruiting people too. Because communities are always changing, the population's always changing. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say for grassroots is like getting together with people, you know, creating a team that can devote their time to doing this kind of work. And then, you know, leveraging pre-existing leadership structures, leveraging those organizations that are already there, church, library, cafe, bar, whatever it may be, that's already there and has already helped people in some way, and like using those organizations and physical spaces to your advantage.
Excellent, great. And I'm so glad one of the things that crew has done is building that kit, that emergency kit. I know at our last presentation that we did with you, or before COVID, when we did, you were able to provide information what is needed in the kit and how to build an emergency kit and so forth. So we're really looking forward, and this information has been very, very informative. One is about the data, connecting with our community groups, building that community group connection, and just taking advantage of some of the training that is available. I know CERT is one of those certification that I'm pushing for community organization to take, which FEMA provides that.
Andrew, and I just put the National CERT Association website link on the chat as well. That's a recently launched association that is really trying to create a network of CERT organizations across the country. So I just put it there. And as a quick wrap up on my end, I wanted to emphasize that the link that says community.fema.gov open training and the link that says ready.gov you are help until help arrives, those are two links that lead you to interactive online classes. One is for the Until Help Arrives and the other one is for the open session. But if you would like to have more of a facilitated webinar for either one of those classes, I'm happy to either do it with you or do it on my own if you have the audience interested in that. So, and actually, if you click on the link, you can actually do it on your own too. There are instruction guides and PowerPoint presentations and everything is there for anybody that would like to do it on their own. But I just want to offer the possibility that we could co-lead it or co-facilitate it if it feels like you don't want to do it on your own the first time. And so those are two really great training resources that are completely free to the community, and you can bring them to your communities as well. So I just wanted to highlight those two links, the one that I sent at 7:22 and the one that I sent at 8:05, just so that you can find them easily on the chat.
Great. And I think every organization, every group, every community group, there has to be a plan, an emergency plan in your manual, in your operations. So for sure, we're going to take you up on that as Caribbean Diaspora Group to be able to get some of those training that you have discussed. Final word, Sarah, and then I'm going to put it on to Quinton, and then Ethan will be the last. Any final words, Sarah?
No, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to listen to the needs and to share all of the resources. And I would love to encourage you to take this information and run with it, or use me as a support system if you need some coaching or some help to figure out how to use it, or use me as your team person so that we can do it together. Basically, as the liaison between the FEMA headquarters and the regional headquarters and the community, I see my role as helping community leaders use the existing resources and bring them to their own communities, because ultimately you guys are the door openers to the communities. That's one thing that the federal government does not have, right? So my role is to really kind of make those links happen. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Sarah. Quinton?
Well, I would just say I was in the Boy Scouts as a kid, and our motto, of course, is be prepared. So the most important thing that all of us can do is to educate ourselves and prepare ourselves for what is to come and what's already happening in some places. So, definitely connect with your neighbors, learn from crew and others how to prepare for different emergencies, and connect with your local government and make sure that they're taking unnecessary action to help protect you as well.
Thank you, Councillor Quintion Zondervan. And Ethan from crew.
Yeah, definitely echo both of those last statements that were made. For sure, utilize these resources that Sarah has graciously posted here, and definitely like utilize all of our separate spheres of like influence or whatnot. Like make sure that you're, getting on your local government. A lot of the change that I talked about was grassroots stuff, but what goes hand in hand with that is like working with local municipalities and pushing for different initiatives and making sure that, groups are voting, etc., that people in your community are playing a role in that. And then like Sarah said too, like utilize crew, like we are here to be used as like a facilitation strategy tool. And that's like what our primary function is. So if there's anyone in your community, anyone on this call, it only needs to be like 4 to 5 people. We can get a crew team going and we can help start providing resources and whatever people want to accomplish, whichever initiatives they want to try to get done. We'll definitely put our full energy into supporting that. And then something that's really important too about getting after this and doing that is like making sure we're all realizing that these emergencies are already taking place and we're very much so in it right now, even though some days it doesn't feel like it. Like we've all become very like acclimated, or at least some of us are privileged enough to be familiar with COVID right now, but it's still very much so an emergency. And then when I think about all the heat related stuff that's happened, and like yesterday was like, a scorcher. And people were feeling that. May or may not have been anyone on this call, but people were definitely feeling that. So these emergency situations are already starting to play themselves out in a lot of different communities that, we might not hear from, or you might not see it on the news just yet, but believe that it's already happening. So make sure, like, even though it can feel awkward, even if our neighborhoods aren't fully there yet, like, going out there with concerned community members and with family members and trying to set up all those things we discussed today. Like at the very least, try to set up an emergency plan, with your loved ones, because this stuff is already well on its way. And crew, as an adaptive group, we're pretty aware of the fact that even if we push forward all the mitigation efforts we want, and even if we took every single car off the road, like, we are going to be feeling this stuff for a pretty long time, probably for our lifetime. So there's no better time than now to really go out there and start setting up these systems. And like, it just start with your family and then draw a bigger circle after that.
Thank you very, very much. And we here at the Authentic Caribbean Foundation is really happy and pleased that we're bringing to the forefront the importance of climate change, and especially for Caribbean community who are very vulnerable. And, we're affected extremely. And we see that even with COVID, we have been affected, our community has been the highest affected one in the COVID. So the importance as organization and as leaders is, implementing strategies, ensuring that we plan ahead for these disasters, these extreme weather, and see how we can enhance the awareness to our community of the importance of climate change and the extreme weather that will continue to affect us. Every year it gets worse and worse. So the importance of reduction in our emission and proper energy resources Let's not forget about food security also is another element in terms of proper nutrition and so forth. So it's with great pleasure that you guys joined us on our first series of disaster preparedness. And we're looking forward to many more. We're looking forward to working with organizations and members on this call to see how we can do some assessment and tackle some of the issues that we're faced with and take advantage of the training that is available here in the diaspora and see how we also can help within our community and within the Caribbean region that our family and people reside. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. You have any questions, Jennifer, Donna, Max, Iris, Leslie, Ruth, Claudette? Great. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. And I want to thank the presenters, Sarah, Quinton, and Ethan. And any other question, just reach out to us. All the information, the links are provided where you could get more information with regards to the training, and even ready.gov is very informative where it lists a lot of different topics: pandemic, response to corona, extreme heat, build a kit, hurricanes, flooding, emergency alert, and make a plan. So it's great to have you, and I want to thank everyone. And be safe out there, and hopefully we'll be able to defeat this COVID virus that is upon us. And let's not forget wearing off the mask, social distancing, are key element for us, not only here in America, but we see also in the region. There have been more cases that has been imported, that other islands had to shut down their borders. So, you know, it's a worldwide effort needed to combat this COVID virus, and just being prepared, you know, ensuring that we adhere to these requirements, face mask and social distance. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful afternoon. And
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for facilitating, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing.
Bye,
Miranda,
all.
could you stay back just 1 minute, please? Oh, she left.
I'll connect you, Megan.
Okay.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye, Andrew.